Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to attend this event hosted by Neuroscience Research Group. If you don't mind, please private message me, I'm Alexandra Vesia, your student number if you're a York student, and your email address if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. As well, if you have any questions that arise during the talk, please feel free to write those in the chat, and afterwards we'll be asking those in order. Our club, Neuroscience Research Group at York University, is proud to introduce Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist studying the relationship between brain functioning and various mental states, including religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences. He is a pioneer in the field known as neurotheology. His research includes taking brain scans of people in prayer, meditation, rituals, and trance states in an attempt to better understand the nature of religious and spiritual practices. He has also evaluated the relationship between religious or spiritual phenomena and health and the effect of meditation on memory. He's written over a dozen books, including Neurotheology, How Science Can Enlighten Us About Spirituality, and his latest co-authored book, The Rabbi's Brain, Mystics, Moderns, and the Science of Jewish Thinking. Dr. Newberg is the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and a physician at Jefferson University Hospital. He is board certified in internal medicine and nuclear medicine. It is our sincerest pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it, and very excited to be here to share with everyone some of the work I've been engaged in over the last 25, 30 years, actually. I can't believe it's been that long. I don't think I'm that old, but it's been very exciting. And as much as I've been fortunate enough to be able to do over the last 25 years or so, I often end up saying to everyone that we're just scratching the surface and there is so much more for us to learn and understand. And so I'll look forward to sharing all of this information with you and look forward to your questions on, and you'll get a chance to see what neurotheology is all about. So I am going to share my screen. Sorry, there we go. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Good, okay. So there we go. So the first question, of course, is why are we talking about this at all, especially in a neuroscience group? And I've always thought I should have some good answers for that question. So I think there are some really important reasons for thinking about doing this kind of research. And so my first slide is, why do we need a Principia Neurotheologica? That was actually the title that I originally wanted for the book, but my editor decided to go with Principles of Neurotheology. He thought it would be too crazy to be Latinized and wouldn't work very well. So, but I managed to sneak it in there as the first chapter. But the idea of neurotheology is that it is a unique field of scholarship that seeks to understand the relationship or the link specifically between the brain and theology, but certainly more broadly between the mind and religion. And as you might imagine, the topic of neurotheology has gotten a lot of attention in both the academic as well as the lay communities. There's one of the things that I do find exciting about it is that as a multidisciplinary endeavor, there are people who are very religious who are interested in these questions. There are people who are very non-religious who are interested in these questions. There are psychologists and psychiatrists interested, neuroscientists. And as you heard, you know, we look at this from a very practical perspectives of how one might bring in practices like meditation into the medical environment, all the way to some very profound theological questions. And we're going to try to cover all of that in a relatively short period of time here. And of course, you know, when people do think about this, there may be both some positive as well as negative responses. You know, what is it? Is it okay to be doing this kind of research? What does it mean? And what are the kinds of conclusions that we might be able to expect to be able to draw from this kind of research? So for neurotheology, I think to be considered a viable field going forward, one of the important aspects of this, and the title of the talk, is that to basically try to create a set of clear principles. And I put these forth in the book, Principles of Neurotheology. I came up with 54 principles altogether, which actually turns out to be a kind of an interesting number because it's 3 times 18. And 18, of course, is a very special number in Judaism, which means life. And 3, of course, represents the Trinity in Christianity. So we hit two of the major religious traditions. But I think, a very important point about all this is that this kind of research really expands to all the different areas of religious and spiritual activity in humanity. As you heard, my most recent book is about Judaism, but we're working on new books on Catholicism, on Islam, on Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth. So it really can be applied to many different kinds of traditions. Now, the basic principles, the basic elements for such principles, I think, need to address a variety of aspects of what neurotheology is about. So it is, it's a field of scholarship, it's a field of research. And so we need to think about methodological principles, how do we do this kind of work? We need to think about various scientific as well as religious perspectives. And to a certain extent, I think if neurotheology is going to work as this kind of hybrid field that brings together in a positive way, science and religion, then the principles have to be, the approaches that we have to take have to be acceptable at least, or supported by both the religious or theological side as well as the scientific one. And then hopefully by having these principles, we can continue to develop them for future research and discourse and scholarship. Now, let me just say a few things about neurotheology. I don't know how many of you have heard the term. Actually, interestingly enough, the first mention of the term neurotheology that I'm aware of came from a book, a novel that was written by Aldous Huxley in 1961 called The Island. And he talks about this futuristic society that does all kinds of strange things. And one of those strange things is neurotheology, but he doesn't really take it much beyond that. So there have been a number of scholars more recently, and I will address that in a moment. But I think an important point about neurotheology is that in many ways, it goes way back. It goes back thousands of years to the earliest work done in Buddhist and Hindu traditions, basically looking at, the mind, the sense of self, our sense of consciousness. They didn't necessarily know about the temporal lobes and the parietal lobes and brain scans and all that kind of thing, but they understood that we had, cognitive processes, we had experiences, we had emotions, and how do we put that all together to help us understand who we are as human beings? Even in the Western traditions, while they didn't necessarily get into mind and consciousness as much, there was certainly an emphasis on human thoughts and behaviors and how they may be mediated by religious or spiritual traditions. So if we look, for example, at the Bible, you have, for example, the 10 Commandments and the covenants with God. And basically these are based on the notion that there's an understanding of human behavior. And one of the things I often found was interesting was this passage from Deuteronomy, where God is basically talking to human beings and saying that what he's asking us to do is not, some crazy thing or something that's way up in the sky. It's something that each of us can do. And that to me is an important aspect of how we understand neurotheology, because we're talking about how we function as human beings. And of course, then we see this extrapolated into Christianity and Islam. Christianity certainly has a focus that shifts in terms of other aspects of the human psyche, including things like love, devotion, forgiveness, redemption. St. Thomas Aquinas, in his very famous book about 1,000 years ago called Summa Theologica, he engages the issue of human biology and the human mind, distinguishing between what he calls the actus hominis and the actus humanus, the differences between our kind of mental selves and our biological selves. And of course, when we start to think about all of this, we can get into a question about, well, how does modern day science look at this kind of stuff? How does cognitive neuroscience deal with these kinds of dual perspectives on what it means to be a human being? Now, interestingly, maybe a few hundred years ago, we start to see a shift in at least understanding religion and spirituality into something which is more accessible from the psychological or even the neuroscientific perspective. So Friedrich Schleiermacher talked about religion as being more cognitive, more visceral. It's an intuitive sense, a feeling of absolute dependence. So we're talking about a feeling. This is not just coming out of a sacred text, but it's something that we can actually start to understand in terms of various psychological concepts and ideas. William James, a very famous scholar, and wrote in 1902 the book called Varieties of Religious Experience, and basically considered various forms that religion takes in terms of human experiences. And he talks about positive ones, negative ones, a lot of focus on mystical experiences. Also, he was very involved in psychology, so he was very instrumental in kind of pushing all of these topics forward. Rudolf Otto, in a book called The Idea of the Holy, defined the essence of religious awareness as a kind of a mixture of fear and fascination. He described this as mysterium tremendum et fascinans. And more recently, now we had a little bit past the Aldous Huxley novel, but my late mentor and colleague Eugene de Quilly wrote several seminal books in the 1970s. One of them was called Biogenetic Structuralism, the other one Spectrum of Ritual. These were books that were designed to look at these questions from an anthropological perspective. And Eugene de Quilly was a psychiatrist by training. He was an MD, but he also had a PhD in anthropology. And this is pretty interesting that, he started to look at it from this kind of unusual perspective of the evolution of the brain and how that came about in terms of religious and spiritual ideas. James Ashbrook wrote a book called The Humanizing Brain and focused a little bit more on the Christian perspective. James Austin wrote a book called Zen and the Brain, and of course that has its particular perspective from the Zen Buddhist ideas. And of course, as you heard in my introduction, we have started to use brain scans and all different kinds of approaches to be able to explore religious and spiritual experiences. So in now kind of getting a little bit more into the principles of neurotheology, and I am not going to hit on all 54 of them today because I only have about a half hour and I'm already about halfway through. But I want to hit at least some of the highlights, I think, in terms of the more important ones that are relevant for all of us to think about in this context. So the first principle is that neurotheology should strive to provide and seek clear definitions for the topics of its inquiry. Now, in and of itself, the idea of definitions, while often a kind of boring topic, to me is actually very exciting because how do we define these terms? I mean, so many times people ask me, well, what do you mean by spirituality? What do you mean by religion? What do you mean by soul? And these are all wonderful questions that need to be addressed. Where do we get these definitions from? Well, that also is an interesting question. Should we ask a bunch of theologians to define these terms? Philosophers, religious scholars, neuroscientists, who do we ask? And maybe we need to ask all of them, or maybe we need to just ask the general public, what do they mean by spirituality and religion? So there's some really interesting things that come up when you just think about how do you start to even get a hold of these overall topics. And I think it is important to recognize that whatever definitions we start with today, that those definitions are likely to change as we acquire new data and as new scholarship is developed. We might realize that spirituality, we might say that spirituality is the individual experience of the sacred, but then maybe somebody will say, well, but maybe it can be more than that. Maybe it can be something more creative. Maybe it can be something more cognitive. So, you get into all these different aspects that change the way in which we define these terms. So this is one of the brain scans that we have done, and I'm going to show a few of these over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. This is a Spect Scan, and if you're not familiar with that, that stands for Single Photon Emission Computed Tomography. It is somewhat similar to PET imaging, positron emission tomography. It involves injecting a radioactive tracer that follows some part of the brain's physiology. So in this case, we're looking at blood flow, but some very exciting work, which I probably won't have too much time to touch on, right now, is looking at neurotransmitters, which is really the domain of PET and SPECT imaging, and looking at things like serotonin and dopamine, which we have started to do, and I'm very excited about that current work. But these studies have primarily looked at blood flow, which is somewhat analogous to what you get when you do an fMRI scan, where you're looking at changes in blood flow, changes in brain activity that reflect what areas of the brain are turned on or turned off. And this was a study that we did of a colleague of mine. It was an N of one study, so to speak, where we looked at what his brain was doing when he was deep in meditation. He was a very expert meditator, but he also considered himself to be a pretty profound atheist. He did not believe in God in any way, shape, or form. So we said, well, we've studied people in meditation, but what would happen if the target of your meditation was something that you didn't believe in, like God? And he was willing and able to go into our scanner, and we had him meditate on the notion of God. And the area that you're looking at here with the arrow is the frontal lobes, and particularly the prefrontal cortex. For the general population, I usually talk about it as an attention focusing area. You can see that the colors there, the red activity that you see at baseline, doesn't really change very much when he's contemplating God. In fact, if anything, maybe it's a little bit less. But when we have looked at meditators like nuns and Buddhist meditators who are focusing intently on some kind of sacred object, their frontal lobe activity tends to go way up. And I thought this was kind of an interesting result, because basically what you're seeing is that unless you actually truly believe in the thing that you're doing, the practice that you're engaged in, then typically your brain isn't going to change very much. And that we've done other studies where we've seen that, where, it's not just saying a prayer, for example, just saying the words of the prayer don't do very much unless you really mean it, you're really engaged in it, and it becomes something that you feel very deeply within you. Then you see all kinds of changes going on in the brain. And I should also just parenthetically add that while we're looking at colors here, all of this ultimately is quantifiable as well. So when I tell you that the frontal lobes didn't change much, I know what the percentages in terms of the changes actually were. And in this case, it was like less than 5%. Now, I've gotten this far and I actually haven't even defined neurotheology. So let me do that real briefly. Although I did state the field of study that links neuroscience with religion and theology, but there's a couple of important points that I want to expand upon here. One is that it is really a two-way street. So it is not just a neuroscientific study of religion and theology. It's also not a theological dissertation on what neuroscience may be or how valuable it may be, but it really there needs to be this crosstalk between them. And with that in mind, it's also essential to make sure that the science remains rigorous, but that the religious part, or the spiritual part, maintains itself as well. And what I mean by that is that if I were to bring some people in to do prayer and they really weren't getting very much out of that prayer, then whatever my brain scans show is not really all that relevant, because I've lost the religious part of it. I've lost the spiritual part of it. The other important point is that neuro and theology must be defined very broadly. So the neuro side includes cognitive neuroscience, but it includes medicine and biology. It includes psychiatry and psychology and anthropology, all the different ways in which we get at what's going on within us, and particularly what's going on within our brain. And the theology side also has to be defined very broadly, because we need to just not think about theology itself, which is a specific discipline, but the broader aspects of religious and spiritual phenomena. So various practices, meditation, prayer, belief systems, various experiences that people have, mystical experiences, near-death experiences, and so forth. So there is a lot for us to ultimately be able to look at. And we might even be able to get into this interesting concept that I have tried to look at, called a kind of neurotheological hermeneutic. And for those of you who are not familiar with philosophy, hermeneutics refers to the field of study of interpretation. If we go back to look at what Descartes said, what was the conditions within which he made those comments? What was the historical perspective? What science did he know or didn't know? How was he raised? What were the philosophical and theological perspectives of the day? But to me, the brain is the ultimate arbiter of how we look at the different biases and influences that make up whatever any of us think or believe about the world. So, how does the brain affect the ways in which we think, the ways in which we feel and experience our reality? How do they help us in our interpretation of science, as well as various religious and spiritual phenomena? So what I mean by that is, how do we use our causal processes, our binary processes, looking at opposites? How do we think about things? And how do we use this to explore a person's beliefs or ideas about a sacred text like the Bible, or about a mystical experience, or if somebody doesn't believe, how does their brain come to that kind of a conclusion? With that in mind, we've done some very interesting studies of meditation practices over the years. This was a study of a Tibetan Buddhist practice where we asked people to do a very intensive meditation on a sacred object that they visualize. One of the end results of the experience is that they lose their sense of self, they lose their sense of space. And one of the areas of the brain that we have looked at that seems to be particularly involved in this process is the parietal lobe, which I've listed here as an orientation area. And you may know that the parietal lobe typically takes our sensory information and helps us to construct a sense of ourself and helps that self relate to the world in some kind of spatial way. So we have proposed that if a person gets into a deep practice of meditation, that you actually preferentially block sensory input into this area of the brain because you're so concentrated on the particular object. But if you continue to block the activity that gets into this area, then it starts to quiet down. And if this area normally turns on to help us to establish our sense of self and space, then shutting down we would expect the person to lose their sense of self and to lose their sense of space. And that's exactly what we see in so many different kinds of practices where people talk about these kinds of changes phenomenologically, and we see that they correlate with what's going on from a physiological perspective. So when it comes to various methodological challenges, theology and neuroscience must allow for new methods, new concepts, and conclusions to arise from this neurotheological work. And I think that this is important to think about the limitations that we currently have. You know, when I just show you these brain scans and I say the frontal lobe lights up, well, what exactly does that mean? I mean, how many, you're looking at an area of maybe a couple of inches, you know, how many millions, if not billions of neurons are in there? Are they all turning on? Or some of them turning on? Are the neurons that are turning on inhibitory neurons? Are they stimulatory neurons? Are they dopaminergic, acetylcholinergic? You know, there's so many different things for us to look at. And we may really have to develop our methods to a much greater extent and be open to that development. And maybe even through the study of neurotheology, we may find new kinds of methods. In fact, I always challenge my colleagues that this whole field of study is really very important for science, because, you know, to grab onto something like spirituality, which is very difficult to assess and measure, you know, what kind of questions might one ask, how would one look at this biologically? These are challenges for science to be able to do. So I think that there's a lot of great scientific work and methodologies that can come from this kind of multidisciplinary approach that hopefully will allow for a wide array of variables to evaluate and to see how they have an impact on both the science as well as the religious and spiritual. We also have to look at the phenomenological characteristics of various religious and spiritual phenomena. Too often science has measured something that is not the thing it is intended to measure. And this is the point I was making a few moments ago. If I bring somebody in to do a meditation practice or a prayer practice, if they're not really doing it, then the meaning of the images is not all that worthwhile. So I need to understand the phenomenology, what people feel. I need to find better ways of getting at that, how we ask questions, how do we assess it in different ways. Of course, the field of psychology is very good at this. I mean, I have no way of knowing that a patient is depressed or anxious unless they tell me so. And so, you know, how do I ask that question, and how do I measure, you know, whether somebody's really depressed or just a little bit depressed? So there are good ways of doing all of that, and we can start to apply those same kind of concepts to the evaluation of various religious and spiritual perspectives. So, you know, this was a cute little study that we designed where we said, well, you know, how do we get at what people think about when they think about religion and spirituality? And certainly we have a very profound use of our visual system with all the ways in which we look at the world. If I were to ask you this question, what does God look like? What is the first thing that pops into your mind? You know, is it a face? Is it some kind of, you know, spirit? Is it a cloud? What actually pops into your mind? So we went around and asked people this question. We got about 400 different drawings. Here is one of them from one of our younger people that we studied. And, you know, this is a very well-known perspective on God, the idea of an old man with a beard kind of floating around in the clouds telling us to do different things. And if you think, you know, even though this is probably limited in skill, this is not that different from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and the image of God at the very top of the most beautiful ceiling in the world, probably. So, you know, this is one perspective that people take. Other people have a more abstract concept of God. And this is always one of my favorite ones, bringing in circles, hearts, the male-female symbols, the symbol for peace, the symbol of the sun. Other people drew various, you know, nature scenes and so forth. And when we actually looked at all of these different drawings, about 2/3 of people drew something abstract or some kind of nature scene. In fact, that was split pretty much down the middle. About 20% of people drew faces, and about 15% left it blank. Now, we really want to try to get at all the different things that we can learn. So we didn't just allow people to draw the picture, but we asked them to tell us what they had drawn. We didn't want to interpret it for them. We wanted them to interpret it for us. And the blank ones were particularly interesting to me because sometimes people left it blank because they were devoutly religious. And they said, God is just so unknowable and undrawable that I have to leave it blank. Other people who left it blank were devout atheists because they said there's no God, and so there's nothing to draw. And I think to me, one of the important take-home messages of that little study is that we need to know what people actually mean or think. And that goes back to the principle of definitions. If we get into an argument with somebody about does God exist, first we have to know what that means. What are we talking about when we say, does God? What does that mean? Are we saying, is there a man floating around in the clouds? Is it a spirit? Is it consciousness? Is it the universe? Is it physical? Is it non-physical? Is it supernatural? So, how do we think about this kind of concept? We've got to ask the questions, and we've got to learn from each person what they are actually thinking about. So neurotheology, I think, is able to be applied to a wide range of cognitive processes and also health-related issues. This is the pragmatic side of neuroscience, applied neurotheology, if you will. And it may provide some very information about the nature and function of the human mind or brain, our consciousness. It may help us to find ways of helping to keep people healthier, improve their sense of well-being, reduce depression, anxiety by turning to practices like meditation, prayer, and different rituals. We may also look at some of the negative consequences of these kinds of beliefs. And to me, obviously in the world today, with all of the issues around racism and all the divisiveness that we're seeing in the country today, and really around the world, one of the questions is, well, what's going on? How is this happening in people? Why are people all looking at the same world, and yet one person looks at it from a very right-wing perspective, and somebody looks at it from a very left-wing perspective. Somebody looks at it from a Muslim perspective. Somebody looks at it from a Christian perspective. So, we can do research to explore those kinds of questions. What's going on in the brain of these people that would lead them to thinking about racism, thinking about destroying buildings of people who don't believe the way they do, joining cults and so forth. And as an idealist and an optimist, I do hope that some of this information may be helpful enough that it can help us to redirect people in more positive directions. So that is part of how I think neurotheology may really have an opportunity to help us a lot. And this is a Spect study we did of a practice called Kirtan Kriya meditation that we did with older individuals who are having memory problems. And we taught them this very simple meditation practice. It's a mantra-based practice. You repeat certain sounds over and over again. You do it for 12 minutes a day, and we scan them initially, and then we brought them back in 8 weeks. The A scan is their initial resting scan. The B scan is when they did the meditation for the very first time. The C scan is the resting scan again, but now coming back after 8 weeks. And then the D scan is the final scan. So these are all Spect scans again. And if you look at a couple of important points here, at the very top of the scan, which is where the frontal lobes are, you can see that in the C scan, compared to the A scan, there is more red activity there. And that's consistent with an overall increase in the functionality of their frontal lobes. In fact, some other research from other colleagues has shown that the frontal cortex of long-term meditators is actually physically thicker than those people who are non-meditators. And what we've shown here is that the person's brain actually changes, and it increased by about 10 to 15%, which interestingly correlated with improvements in their cognitive processes and memory scores by about 10 to 15%. So very, very interesting on a very practical level. The other area of the brain that was interesting was the thalamus, which is where the arrow is. So the thalamus, as you may know, is a very central structure in the brain. It is a very important relay, and it brings in a lot of sensory information, specifically from the hearing and visual systems up into the brain. And you can see that in the A scan, that one side of the thalamus, the right side, is more active, more red than the other side. But when they come back and for the C scan, the thalamus is much more symmetric. And actually on the D scan, when they do the final meditation, it seems to shift even more the other way. So if this is a very, central structure of the brain that has a lot to do with our consciousness and just our overall perspectives of reality, if we can change this by having them do a practice for 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks, you can imagine what's going on in the brain of a nun or a monk who might be doing these practices for hours a day for a lifetime. And how does that change the way their brain works? How does it change the way their brain thinks? How does it change the way they believe and look at the world around them? Consciousness, of course, is another just massive issue and problem for neuroscience and philosophy alike. Neurotheology may have some very interesting things to say about consciousness because it's particularly in spiritual traditions like Buddhism and Hinduism that people get into trance states, meditative states, where they experience altered states of consciousness. Other shamanic cultures around the world utilize different substances like peyote and magic mushrooms or psilocybin that give them these different spiritual experiences. So neurotheology can help us look at what's going on in these altered states of consciousness, help us to try to understand what's happening in the brain, what's going on in terms of the activity in different parts of the brain, the neurotransmitter parts of the brain, and may even begin to ask or encourage some very interesting explorations about what is really the basis of the universe around us. Is it really matter? Is it consciousness? And of course, this is what's called the hard problem of consciousness. How do we start with this lump of chemicals in our brain that are all by themselves are non-conscious and somehow create consciousness? So obviously one answer is that all those molecules in the brain have some kind of consciousness and therefore they create consciousness. Now, where the answer is, I don't know, but maybe this kind of research could be something that could really help us to look at what is the nature of consciousness and how does consciousness and matter relate to each other, and does this have important implications for understanding the true nature of reality? And we do some interesting studies of people who have these very different perspectives on what reality is. We did a study of Brazilian mediums where we asked them to get into the trance state that they normally get into. And in those trance states, they perceive that they are communicating with the dead, the spirits of the dead. And we see profound changes going on in these different areas of the brain, like the anterior cingulate cortex, parts of the temporal lobe, and parts of the limbic system, like the hippocampus. So if they're able to evoke these kinds of changes, does that mean that the brain is causing these kinds of experiences? Is it responding to the spirits that are out there somewhere? How do we look at all of this? And there's some really fascinating questions that have implications for science, for philosophy, for religion and spirituality as well. And so we might think about how neurotheology may inform various theological questions. And again, this is an entire coursework or even PhD program that could be developed around this kind of stuff. How do people even think about whether there is a God or not? What about free will? What people who believe that there can be revelation or some kind of salvation? If you're saved, what gets saved? Does your soul get saved? Your brain, your body? How do you think about these things? So I think a neurotheological perspective may contribute to all of these kinds of existing theological and philosophical questions. It doesn't get rid of any of the philosophy or theology that exists, but it adds a new perspective that we've never had before. And maybe it teaches us something interesting about what these different questions are about and how our brain actually tries to engage these kinds of questions. How does an atheist engage the question of, does God exist? And how does that differ from a very devout religious person? And or someone who's Buddhist who may not necessarily believe in God, but believes in some type of universal consciousness. And then finally, one of the most important points of neurotheology, I think, comes in the form of what I would refer to as Neuro Epistemology. The idea that there may ultimately be epistemological claims about the nature of reality that should be accessible to both religious and spiritual perspectives as well as scientific analysis. But we have to be very careful about what kinds of conclusions that we make. So when we look at the study of Brazilian mediums, we have to be careful about jumping to the conclusion that yes, that was just purely a brain phenomena, or yes, it was amazing that the spirits somehow got into this person's brain. The brain scan just shows what's going on in their brain when they're having the experience. It doesn't necessarily tell you the true reality of that experience, but perhaps by exploring the phenomenological side, the scientific side, the spiritual side, we might be able to get closer to answering some of the very big questions about reality. So in this, extremely whirlwind discussion about neurotheology, hopefully I have demonstrated to all of you that it can be a very important field of scholarship in the future. I'd love to, you all are the future of these sciences and these fields, so I would love to hear from any and all of you about your interest in these kinds of questions. And I work with a lot of students over the years to try to explore these ideas in different kinds of ways. I hope that neurotheology may provide important information in the domains of science and certainly in the domains of religion and spirituality. And hopefully we can use all of this information to move us a little bit along the human path of discovery. One of the other principles that I always talk about is, having that passion for inquiry, always pushing the envelope, always never being afraid to ask the question. And any good research always generates more questions than answers, I think. So hopefully this will just propel us, all of humanity, on an individual as well as a global level, towards some perhaps better enlightenment. And the last thing I'll just say is that, one thing that often gets overlooked in all of these fields is humor. And so I will, I thought I had a quote here, sorry, there it is. So Groucho Marx, the famous comedian, once said, "These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others." So I'll stand by that as well for my principles of neurotheology. Anyway, so thanks very much. And if any of you are interested, here is one of the books, The Principles of Neurotheology. And if you are interested, I would certainly love to hear from you. You can reach me through my website, which is just andrewnewberg.com. And you can also look into the research articles. So all that stuff I was saying quickly about the Brazilian mediums and all that, you can find the articles there, and also some of the other books for anyone who is interested in exploring these kinds of topics further. So thanks very much. And I did pretty good with getting done. So open up for some questions. And I don't know how you want to handle that. I don't know if students going to send them in on, I'll stop my share here.
Oh, thank you so much. That's
Sure.
a lot of information. And yeah, I'm sure it has sparked a lot of curious minds right now. So we do have a few questions, and I'm just wondering, Philip, if you'd like to ask your question aloud, or if you'd like me to ask it for you.
You want me? I can see them in the chat. Is that where you want me to grab these questions?
Yeah, for sure. I'm just wondering if he wanted to vocalize his question.
Sure.
Sound. Philip, are you there? Okay. Yeah.
So the question is, what are your thoughts on temporal lobe seizures and how they might induce mystical experiences? So this is a really good question. One of the things that I talk about also with regard to neurotheology is the notion that it is like a big jigsaw puzzle, and there are lots of pieces to this puzzle. And so I've mentioned a couple. I mentioned things like meditation and prayer. I talked a little bit about trance states. I mentioned psychedelic types of compounds, and this is another one. So there's been a lot of interesting work exploring various pathological conditions and how that may be related to spiritual experiences. So one of the thoughts is that people who have temporal lobe seizures may have a predisposition for unusual spiritual experiences, and it arose because there have been some people like that. Interestingly, it's a very small percentage of people who have temporal lobe seizures. So only about, probably less than about 5% of people who have temporal lobe seizures actually have unusual religious or spiritual experiences. So on one hand, right off the bat, while it's interesting that there seems to be some people who do have that, it's difficult to start to generalize and say, well, maybe everybody who's had these profound experiences has some kind of seizure disorder or something like that. But it is important, and it does tell us something about the relevance of the temporal lobe. While I, kind of touched on this a little bit throughout all of my discussions tonight, what you may have kind of gotten from that is that there are many different parts of the brain that are involved in religious and spiritual phenomena. And that really should come as no surprise. When you think about religious and spiritual phenomena, there are cognitive elements, emotional elements, experiential elements as well. And so, there isn't just one part of our brain that turns on, when you walk into a church, for example. There are many different parts of our brain that become involved. In fact, it is a very complex network of structures that becomes activated, and it depends a little bit upon how that happens. And sometimes it happens pathologically. There was a very interesting study of people with different kinds of head injuries that talked about the relationship between that and different spiritual feelings. So there's clearly a relationship, and it clearly helps to fill in some of the information that we need to know about what parts of the brain are particularly involved in these experiences. So let's see. Wait, am I going forwards or? Okay, so that was that question. So I have this question from somebody named Harley. A study was conducted using cranial magnetic stimulation on the prefrontal cortex, and it was known to alter the belief in God and prejudice. Michael Persinger did a study using what's called the God helmet, and he was stimulating the temporal lobes. That was his argument. So the question is, can religious beliefs be altered long-term using some kind of stimulation technique like transcranial magnetic stimulation? Again, another really interesting piece of the puzzle here. Brain stimulation studies, and we know that as the question asked, that brain stimulation seems to have some pretty profound impact on the brain. It can alter people's moods. It's been used in people with depression, and there have been some growing number of studies like Michael Persinger's work. It's interesting. It's interesting to think about what this may mean, what parts of the brain may be stimulated. If you stimulate certain parts, does it enable different kinds of experiences? For example, the question mentions the prefrontal cortex. Well, we've argued that while the prefrontal cortex may go up in certain concentrative practices, that actually during mystical experiences, it may actually drop down. And that the dropping down may be associated with experiences of a loss of will or a sense of surrender. And we have seen that in practices where the person just feels like the experience is just kind of overwhelming them and that they are no longer making it happen. So there can be some really interesting possibilities going forward, but I will throw out one other little piece to this, which goes back to the epistemology issue. As many of you hopefully can see, although imaging on the computers is never great, I wear glasses. So when I wake up in the morning, my glasses aren't on and I look at the world and it's very blurry. And then I put my glasses on and I can see the world very clearly. So if I use that analogy, who's to say that if we stimulate the brain in a certain way, or if somebody has a disorder in a certain way, that they actually don't see the world more accurately rather than less accurately? And so maybe there is a spiritual world, for the shamanic traditions, all the people, the shamans out there, when they take psilocybin, when they take mushrooms or whatever, and they enter into a spiritual world, that is the window into that spiritual world. It sort of elevates their brain to a level where they can see the world the right way instead of the wrong way, so to speak. And I'm speaking somewhat euphemistically here. So, in our westernized perspective, we say, oh, they took the mushrooms, they had the experience, it caused the experience. It's purely a brain phenomena. But there are other interpretations of that kind of result. And I'm not saying one's right or not, but it does raise some really interesting questions. And we can continue to try to develop studies that hopefully help us to answer those questions about whether or not these kinds of techniques work and what they actually mean. But one last point I'll say about this question, because it's just such an important one, is that all of the practices that exist within spiritual traditions and religious traditions are stimulatory practices, whether you're doing meditation, whether you're taking a walk in the woods, whether you're fasting, whether you're dancing with some kind of frenzied Sufi dancing. So these are all different ways of stimulating the brain to have a spiritual experience. In today's modern world, maybe we can use transcranial magnetic stimulation in a more precise kind of way. But how different is it really from those other kinds of practices in kind of a very global perspective? So some really interesting things for us to think about. Let's see. So here's a question from Angela. Do you have any plans to study voodoo spiritual states, voodoo spiritual states? My understanding is that people experiencing these states have abilities to ignore pain. And has there been anything to neurologically explain that phenomena? Well, I would love to, if I had $1 billion, I would study every practice out there and every state out there. So I would love to keep doing that. And we have looked at a lot of different experiences. Oddly enough, and I don't know if this is another answer to this question, it wasn't so much with any kind of like a trance state per se, but I was actually on a television show, I believe it was on the History Channel, called In Search Of, and Zachary Quinto, who plays Mr. Spock in the new Star Trek movies, was the host, and he came in with a Shaolin monk who apparently does not feel pain, and someone who has a disorder, a genetic disorder called CIP, congenital insensitivity to pain, doesn't actually have the pain sensors in them. And we scanned their brain during a cold pressor test where you put your hand in cold ice water, which causes pain. And it was really quite fascinating. Zachary Quinto really, his sensory areas really lit up initially, but he was able to meditate and try to suppress that response. And so, anytime you activate the frontal lobes, it can help to suppress activity in different parts of the brain. And that may be a partial answer to that question. But also, the person with the CIP felt the cold, but didn't feel the pain. And we saw some activity in his in the sensory areas of the brain, but we didn't see anything going on in terms of pain reception. And then interestingly, the Shaolin monk, when we looked at his brain, it didn't even change between the two states. So, you really are able to sort of modulate how your how your brain is responding to a variety of different external stimuli, including pain. Let's see, some cultures have, this is from Daniel, some cultures have rites of passage to help people enter adulthood. Do you think it would be beneficial for secular parents to create a defined rite of passage for their child? Well, this is also a very intriguing issue. My late colleague and mentor, Jean DeQuilly, did look at a lot of these questions from an anthropological perspective and talked a lot about rituals. So obviously, religious and spiritual traditions have rituals that help with rites of passage, and they help to sort of allow people to feel connected to the world around them. They help people to move from one stage of life to the next, and to that extent, I think almost everybody has to have those kinds of rituals, and there probably already exist those secular rituals, and whether it's getting your driver's license or turning 21. There are certain magical things that don't have any religious significance, but nonetheless help us to move from one stage of life to the next, going into college, graduating college. These are all different kinds of rituals and approaches that are like that. But each person, I think, ultimately has to find the pathways and the rituals that work best for them. But they can be very effective, and they can be useful. And I think, a larger point, which may be relevant here, is that many of these practices, many meditation practices, for example, have been secularized. And that can be very, very good because it does allow for lots of people to be able to engage it. But we also have the sort of the neurotheological question of, well, but is it exactly the same? And so, if you do yoga, if you go to your, bulldog yoga class down the street, or your yoga, studio across the hall, and you do some yoga for a half hour, well, that may all be all well and good, and you feel relaxed and you got to stretch out a little bit. So that, it's certainly very positive, but it isn't necessarily going to lead you to a profound spiritual experience, which is what the yogis will try to do with yoga. It was really meant as a way of preparing the mind and consciousness for these profound mystical experiences. And so, there's just different levels with which these different practices can be done. They all can have value, but it's also a matter of what your goals are and how you might try to get to them. So let's see, I have Nathan here who says, my background is not at all neurological. He's a Catholic theologian. And he says, I'm curious about the choice of subjects who feel the experience of their contemplative states. This seems a necessary methodological choice, but one that might limit the pool, so to speak. I'm thinking particularly about Catholic religious adepts and saints like Mother Teresa, and who went through the dark night of the soul? And is there some necessary limitation? This is a great question. This is something that gets into the methodological principles and challenges that we have in neurotheology of who do we study? And there isn't a great answer. I mean, every kind of study can be useful. As the question asks, a lot of our studies did start with people who were very good at whatever it was that they did. We thought at the beginning of all of our research that we didn't want somebody who had just been doing this meditation for a few weeks. We wanted somebody who'd been doing the practice for many years, because we're sticking them with needles, we're putting them in a scanner. We want somebody who can really have this kind of an experience. But as time has gone on, we have started to expand that to other people, and even people who have never done these practices. Actually, apropos of this particular question, one of my more recent studies, which I was very excited about, was a brain imaging study we did of people undergoing a spiritual retreat program based on the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And we scanned them before and after the going through the retreat program. So we didn't interfere with the retreat itself, but we saw some really profound changes in their brain before and after. And these were people who, had some religious backgrounds, but had not gotten into that level of experience. But, the other analogy that I always like to throw out in regard to this kind of a question is, if you wanted to study music, for example, one alternative would be to study Mozart. And you say, I'm going to study the brain of Mozart because this guy just knew music in a way that was completely different than everybody else. The other alternative is to study everybody else and to look at all, even people who can't carry a tune and have, who are tone deaf, and look at the whole range of humanity, and to see that whole, bell curve, or whatever the curve looks like, in terms of music. Now, in this case, maybe religious or spiritual ideas, wouldn't it be great to go to a church and try to study the 100 people who are in the church and find out, who's really engaged, who's just sitting there, how their brains are different, how they believe are different, and so forth. So there are a lot of wonderful questions that we can start to ask. And again, that to me is a really important point, which is that we don't learn about these things unless we start to ask the questions. And I think it's important for us to not just ask the adepts and the people who are, the Mother Teresas of the world, but to ask the everyday person. And in fact, a lot of our more recent research articles were based on a survey that we did, an online survey that we did, where we got about 2,000 people responding about their most intense spiritual experiences. And it's really, it's remarkable. I mean, it's people from all different paths and all different cultures, all different countries, all different traditions. And some people had had these experiences in a church. Some of them had them outside. Some of them were, in that dark night of the soul kind of thing. So it really is, there's just so much for us to learn, but these are the kinds of questions that we got to keep asking. So that's great. In your opinion, from your research into neurotheology, do you think the brain receives or produces consciousness? Is there any research yet that may suggest one or the other? I know there's an argument for decreased activity in what's called the default mode network in mystical experiences, and that allows for the reception of more stimuli. I'm a pretty middle of the road kind of person, and I try to be as unbiased as possible. I have no idea what the answer to that question is, although I would certainly love to know it. But I think we need to be open to both possibilities, and that to me is very important. I don't know if we can say right now that the brain is producing the experiences that we have in our consciousness, or the brain is simply receiving our consciousness, or if consciousness is just something else entirely. But again, I hope this is where neurotheology may help us out a little bit. We might be able to learn a little bit more what these kinds of, what's the difference between the soul, the mind, the brain, consciousness, all wonderful questions that are a part of cognitive neuroscience, philosophy, theology, and hopefully neurotheology will get us a little bit further down the road. Let's see, I'm trying to pay a little attention to time here, so looks like we have a few more questions. This question is about dissociative experiences can cause mystical experiences. Is it possible that mystical experiences are caused when an aspect of the carrier wave of experience is modified, and thus causes a predictive error to make the carrier wave itself focused upon in order to be resolved? So I'm struggling a little bit with that question, but I guess, my main way of answering that would be that, we've certainly looked at dissociative states and the different, there's a whole array of different kinds of dissociative states, ranging from truly pathological, like dissociative identity disorder, to dissociative states that might be associated with psychedelic compounds. And of course, mystical experiences can be dissociative-like or even dissociative, depending on the circumstances. And trying to understand when these experiences are beneficial, when they might cause problems. There have been some case reports where deep meditation practices have been associated with psychotic episodes, very rare and usually very intense practices, but nonetheless something that can happen. So, so we really do have to think about where dissociative elements come in and what that means. Are these controlled dissociative practices? How do we define them, and how do we differentiate it? It gets into another interesting area of sort of psychiatry, which is how do we define what is normal and what is abnormal, and what kinds of experiences are okay to have versus not okay to have. Which leads, I was about to talk about psychedelics again, and this is the next question. So from Ludwig, what is your opinion on the phenomenon of acid death, whereby users of LSD can allegedly experience death while under the influence of the drug, often resulting in a spiritual experience or reinforcement of the religious beliefs, or generation of spiritual beliefs? Yeah, I mean, some fascinating work out of Johns Hopkins University in particular. A guy named Roland Griffiths down there has been doing some interesting work, not so much with LSD, but with psilocybin. And they have really charted how profound these experiences are and how intensely spiritual they are. Actually, our research of our survey, where we looked at the experiences that were had by people and described by people under the auspices of some kind of psychedelic versus those that were not, the experiences are described in extremely similar kinds of ways. And so there certainly is a lot to be said for understanding how similar they can be. One of the advantages of studying LSD types of experiences is that we know where it goes, at least in the sense that we know that it affects the serotonergic system. Although, once again, really interesting question about, well, serotonin isn't the experience, so why does the flood of serotonin from LSD or psilocybin cause this kind of an experience? What does that mean? Where is this experience actually felt? Where is it affecting our consciousness, and how is that happening? So very important issues for us to think about, but nonetheless, studying these kinds of experiences in more detail, I think, are going to be very, very important. And yet again, the next question, another piece of the puzzle, individuals with schizophrenia or manic states. So we have not done a lot of work on that ourselves, but certainly we all know of the schizophrenic patient who believes that they're the Messiah, or has some kind of very unusual or even bizarre spiritual beliefs. We know that that schizophrenia involves certain specific areas of the brain, and particularly some of the dopaminergic areas and some of the subcortical areas as well. So another piece of the puzzle. I don't think that everyone who has a profound mystical experience has had a psychotic episode, but certainly there are schizophrenics who do have unusual religious and spiritual beliefs or delusions. And so another area for us to study and to explore and try to understand it so that we can see where those relationships are, help us to understand what is normal and what is not normal. Could you be a schizophrenic who has a normal religious experience? And could you be an otherwise normal person who has an abnormal or psychotic spiritual experience? So there's a lot of very interesting issues for us to think about. Let's see. Regarding substances, does any of your research have any serious implications for neuropharmacology, as in directional use of substances to elicit some kind of response? Can we utilize these rituals in the idealistic sense, such as some type of religious Hindu? What kinds of religious feelings would they have? Can we invoke these religious feelings? So let's see, and would you find this to be beneficial from a medical perspective? Yeah, so here is where the practical side of things comes back into play. And certainly with the use of psychedelics like psilocybin, there's been a very big expansion of exploring how well these substances might be useful in a purely clinical way. And can we use these kinds of drugs to help people with depression or anxiety? The preliminary data is very encouraging. Interestingly, from what I've seen in some of the data, that part of what drives the response is the spiritual aspect of the experience. So the more spiritual the person feels as the result of taking the psilocybin, the better their response is from an antidepressant perspective. So I think there is definitely a lot of very practical stuff that we can think about here in terms of how we might utilize these practices, how we might utilize different pharmacological agents to help people with different conditions and help them to function more effectively, help them to achieve whatever goals they have more effectively, and hopefully to improve their overall sense of health and well-being. But some really, really interesting things for us to think about. Let's see, some scholars have asserted that the Prophet Muhammad had temporal lobe epilepsy and the Buddha was consuming psychedelics. While this may not be verifiable, do you think that there is an altered state of consciousness to prophecy? Well, certainly, I think people who have had these kinds of experiences are probably having them under the auspices of some altered state of consciousness. Again, it depends a little bit on how you define that particular term. And there are some intriguing research articles that do talk about the diagnosis of some of these great religious figures of history. It is an interesting thought process, thought project, but obviously in some ways it's futile because we certainly have no way of ever testing that for sure. As you mentioned, it's not verifiable, but certainly we can start to think about people in today's world who speak in tongues and have very intense trance-like states, and to see what kinds of things they experience, what goes on in their brain, and how it may or may not be similar to what some of the great religious figures have described. Another one that people talk about a lot is Paul on the road to Damascus, that when he has that experience and he falls down and then he can't see, so there are interesting descriptions of this stuff, and we have an opportunity to kind of reflect on where those similarities and differences may be. Let's see. What do you think about the theory that religious and spiritual thinking developed in the brain from the consumption of psychoactive mushrooms, common in areas where different religions were spurred? Certainly that's something that we may never know, but it is fascinating that mystical experiences appear to have been around for a very, very long time. In fact, I had been contacted at one point by people studying some of the cave art and some of these ancient caves going back 25, 30,000 years in France, in Africa, that appear to depict kind of mystical journeys, if you will. And so whether or not they were spurred on by substances, whether there was something else that was part of that, great question. I don't know for sure. We may never know exactly how or why these different traditions came about, but it certainly raises a lot of things for us to think about. And I think, neurotheology, again, can kind of be used as that hybrid approach to explore these kinds of questions in a way that we've just never been able to do before. So I think that might be the last one I got. Somebody asked a question, can mysticism be considered errors of consciousness itself? That, again, the problem with thinking about things with some kind of, positive versus negative, or normal versus abnormal, or correct versus an error, is very difficult to really get a hold of, because it depends a lot on how you define these things. What exactly is normal consciousness, and what does an error in consciousness mean? How would we even think about defining it? Clearly, it is a change in consciousness, and in that sense might be an error, but it might be very difficult for us to truly know whether or not it is a flaw or a defect compared to a normal kind of experience. And again, there are some interesting studies that have been done that have looked at pathological conditions in people who have brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Another whole area is looking at neurodegenerative diseases and how that affects spiritual beliefs in people as the brain deteriorates. So again, just a lot of different ways of thinking about that. Anyway, I think that's about it. But there are, again, some really just scratching the surface here. There's some very exciting stuff ahead, and hopefully, whether we approach that from a more neuroscientific side or a more religious and theological side, or from both, there's just a lot left for anyone who is interested in exploring these questions to begin to engage them and to think about them again from this sort of broad continuum, from the very practical to the profoundly esoteric, and some of my favorite questions are about free will and some of the things that you've all raised about consciousness and diseases and the meaning of reality and our perspectives on reality. It's just endless, and that hopefully will keep me busy for the next 25, 30 years, and hopefully a lot of you will start to think about those questions as well. So I will leave it there, and thanks again for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. There's a lot of information circulating, and I'm sure everyone here has learned something new. I know I certainly have. So thank you so much for your time today. And
my pleasure. And like I said, feel free, if anybody's interested, feel free to reach out to me. Be patient with me, and certainly I get a lot of emails and stuff, so I try to get to them as quickly as I can, but love to hear from anybody who wants to keep asking the questions.
For sure. And just on that note, if anyone does want to stick around and continue chatting, we are open to that. And Andrew, you're welcome to leave anytime you need to.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you. All the best.
Bye-bye.